Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really digging into one of the most, well, complex and long-running relationships out there, U.S. and Iran.
Mm. It's a dynamic that seemed to constantly be in the headlines, often framed by this cycle of tension.
Exactly. And what we want to do today is try to cut through some of that noise, trace the key military actions, and maybe the threats, too, that have really shaped this whole thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's try and unpack this.
Yeah, and I think what's really important here for you listening is to grasp that while, okay, there hasn't been a full-scale U.S. invasion of Iran like you might see elsewhere,
Right.
there's this really significant history, a long history of military actions, close calls, threats
Yeah.
that have just profoundly formed the relationship we see today.
So the goal is to get a clearer picture, sort of a timeline of these key moments.
Precisely, because understanding this history, it's just essential for making sense of what's happening now geopolitically. And frankly, it helps avoid that feeling of just being overwhelmed every time a new headline pops up.
Okay, so where do we start? It actually goes back further than many people might think, right? All the way to 1953.
That's right, Operation AX.
Operation 8X. Now, this wasn't a military attack in the, conventional sense, but it was a huge intervention. The U.S. was absolutely central, involved in overthrowing Iran's elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh.
And the trigger, the main reason was oil. Mossadegh had nationalized Iran's oil industry.
Which understandably didn't go down well with Britain or the U.S. within their, well, massive economic interests there.
Not at all. So the CIA basically orchestrated a coup, brought back Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. And that really set the scene for decades of U.S.-backed rule, which wasn't always popular, to say the least.
Authoritarian rule, really.
Yeah. And that stage setting you mentioned, you really can't overstate it. This wasn't just some historical blip. It created this deep, deep mistrust within Iran.
You can see how it would.
It became like a foundational element for anti-Western sentiment later on. And honestly, you still see the echoes today. This drive for strategic independence, even if it costs them economically, it's a core grievance.
So those seeds of mistrust from 53, they definitely didn't just disappear. They grew. And about 25 years later, boom, 1979, the Islamic
A
Revolution.
massive shift. The
Yeah.
Shah is overthrown.
And then the U.S. Embassy in Tehran is stormed. Militants take 52 Americans hostage for 444 days.
An incredibly tense period.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the U.S. response, diplomatic ties completely severed, economic sanctions imposed, Iranian assets frozen. Now, again, not a direct U.S. military attack on Iran, but it certainly felt like a point of no return for normal relations, didn't it?
It absolutely was. And more than symbolic, it meant those crucial channels, the ones you need to maybe de-escalate a crisis, gone.
Right.
The hostage crisis really cemented this adversarial dynamic. It went from the U.S. having influence, maybe unwelcome influence, to direct confrontation. And that lack of direct talk has just made finding solutions incredibly hard ever since.
Okay, moving into the 1980s, things get even more direct and tragically so at times. This is during the Iran-Iraq War, a really brutal conflict from 80 to 88.
And both sides were attacking oil tankers in the Persian Gulf.
So the U.S. Navy gets involved, mainly protecting shipping. This whole phase became known as the Tanker War.
Right. But then comes this absolutely stark incident, really devastating. 1988, the U.S. Navy cruiser, the Vincennes,
Yeah.
it shoots down an Iranian passenger plane, Iran Air Flight 655. They mistook it for a hostile F-14 fighter jet.
Just horrific. 290 people killed, civilians. It's hard to even fathom the level of animosity that must have generated, even accepting it was a mistake.
Oh, the impact was enormous. I mean, it's hard to overstate. This was a direct military confrontation, even if accidental, with the terrible loss of civilian life.
Right.
It just highlighted how dangerous things were in the Gulf, how close operations were. And for Iran, it reinforced this image, this perception of the U.S. as, well, an aggressive and lethal presence.
You still hear it brought up today, don't you?
Absolutely. It remains a powerful symbol for Iran of U.S. hostility. It became another deep scar, essentially, in their collective memory.
So each event just layers on top of the previous one.
Exactly, shaping their strategic thinking, their worldview.
And that sense of proximity, of directness, it only ramps up as we get into the 2000s,
Yes.
especially after the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003.
Right, because suddenly U.S. forces are right there, next door. Iran shares that long border with Iraq.
And Iran inevitably gets drawn into the chaos in Iraq. The U.S. starts accusing Iran pretty openly of supporting Shiite militias who are attacking U.S. troops.
And also backing groups like Hezbollah elsewhere.
So the U.S. response involves things like covert ops, plus just having a large military footprint aimed at pushing back against Iran's influence. It really changed the whole regional game board, didn't it?
Completely redrew the map in
Yeah.
some ways. But before this, the U.S. and Iran might clash through proxies or
Yeah.
argue from afar. But with U.S. troops physically on Iran's border,
Mm.
it turned this sort of indirect rivalry into something much more immediate, much more dangerous. Both sides were operating in the same space. The stakes just shot way up.
And that feeling escalated even more just a few years later, around 2007. The U.S. starts this pretty significant military buildup in the Persian Gulf.
hmm And this was explicitly presented as a deterrent.
Right, aimed at Iran's activities. Specifically, concerns were growing about their nuclear program and also their ongoing role in Iraq, supporting insurgents.
So this increased military presence, naturally, it just fueled fears. Fears of a potential direct shooting war between the two. It felt like a very deliberate flexing of muscles.
A show of
It
force.
absolutely was. A clear signal from Washington. Serious intent. It made the risk calculations on both sides much, much higher. Created this really volatile environment where one wrong move, one misstep, could have triggered something much bigger.
It was about projecting power, setting red lines.
Exactly. Hoping to deter conflict while showing they were ready for it.
Then we get to the 2010s, and for a moment it looked like maybe things might de-escalate. But that didn't last long.
Right, you have the Iran nuclear deal in 2015, the JCPOA,
Yeah.
under President Obama.
Yeah, the U.S., along with other world powers, agrees to lift sanctions in return for Iran limiting its nuclear program.
Seemed like a potential off-ramp, maybe.
But then, just a few years later, 2018, President Trump pulls the U.S. out of the deal. A huge shift.
Dramatic.
And almost immediately, you see tensions start ratcheting back up again. It felt like whiplash, really, if you were following it closely.
It really was a critical moment, but maybe for reasons deeper than just the policy itself.
Yes, so.
Well, withdrawing from the JCPOA wasn't just reversing a policy. It kind of highlighted this fundamental disconnect, how each side saw the whole situation.
Okay.
For one side, the deal was, okay, maybe flawed, but a pragmatic, diplomatic path. For the other, it was fundamentally flawed, built on mistrust, rooted in that history we talked about.
So back to those historical grievances.
Exactly. This pattern of misaligned views, driven by that deep history, it just keeps cropping up. It's a constant barrier to finding any lasting agreement. The deal, or the lack of a deal, just became another flashpoint.
And that renewed tension, that confrontation, it hit an absolute peak in January 2020, one of the most significant military actions in recent memory.
The Soleimani strike.
Yeah, January 3rd. A U.S. airstrike in Baghdad kills General Qasem Soleimani, head of Iran's Quds Force, part of the IRGC.
A hugely powerful figure in Iran. Almost a legendary status for some.
Right, seen as this architect of Iran's regional influence. The strike, ordered by President Trump, was justified as preemptive to stop an imminent attack on Americans. The reaction was immediate. Iran vows revenge, tensions go through the roof, war of words, missile attacks. From your perspective, was there any real precedent for targeting someone that high up in the Iranian system so directly, or did this just rewrite the rulebook?
That's a great question. And the answer is probably not in this way. I mean, sure, there have been covert actions, sabotage maybe, but such a direct public targeting of a top-tier Iranian military leader by the U.S., arguably unprecedented in recent decades.
So a major escalation.
Huge. It went beyond the usual proxy fights to a direct hit on their core leadership. It absolutely pushed things to the brink of open war, and it completely scrambled the perceived rules of engagement, made future red lines way fuzzier for everyone.
And Iran did retaliate. After Soleimani was killed, they launched missiles at Iraqi bases where U.S. troops were stationed.
Caused damage, but importantly, no American deaths.
Right. But then, just hours later, in this incredibly tragic turn, Iran accidentally shoots down a Ukrainian passenger plane, flight PS-752.
Just after takeoff from Tehran.
Killing all 176 people on board, mostly Iranians and Canadians. A horrific tragedy happening right in the midst of this military tension, but totally separate from the military targets.
It was a devastating ripple effect. That extreme tension, being on high alert. The downing wasn't a direct military act in the conflict, but it showed just horribly how fast miscalculation under pressure can lead to immense human cost, far beyond the intended targets.
Yeah.
It just added another layer of grief and mistrust, not just U.S.-Iran, but internally for Iran, and with countries like Canada, too.
So as we look at the last decade or so, the 2010s into the 2020s, We see these tensions continue, but maybe morphing more into ongoing proxy conflicts. You see it across the Middle East, Syria, Yemen, Lebanon.
That's right. The U.S. often backs groups opposing Iranian-backed militias or governments.
And Iran, conversely, is widely seen as supporting groups like Hezbollah or the Houthis in Yemen.
It's that indirect struggle playing out. But it's not just boots on the ground or militias, is it? There's another whole domain now.
Cyber warfare.
Exactly. Which highlights this really crucial evolution in how this conflict happens. Direct, big military strikes are mostly avoided, maybe because the consequences are too high. But these proxy fights, and especially cyber warfare, they're new, significant fronts. They allow for disruption, spying, even real damage, but without that overt kinetic clash that risks all-out war.
Like the reported U.S. cyber attacks on Iranian nuclear facilities.
Precisely. That's a way to apply serious pressure.
Yeah.
Subtly, but powerfully.
So it's like this constant simmering conflict happening on multiple levels, often below the surface, even when it's not making headlines every day.
That's a good way to put it. A continuous, maybe low-grade intensity, but high-impact struggle for influence, fought with all sorts of means that fall short of declared war, but are still deeply felt.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Almost a century of these complex, often really tense interactions between the U.S. and Iran.
Yeah.
From that 1953 coup sowing the first seeds of distrust, through the hostage crisis, the tragic tanker war incident, the downing of Flight 655.
The shifts after the Iraq invasion, the roller coaster of the nuclear deal.
Right, and then the Soleimani assassination, and now these ongoing proxy fights and cyber battles. The themes seem pretty clear. Indirect conflict, strategic moves, sometimes tragic miscalculations and escalations. Hopefully, for you listening, this gives a clearer lens on this really intricate relationship.
Yeah, and understanding this history, it really is vital for making sense of what's happening now and what might happen next.
Yeah.
Because even after all these decades, the relationship is still incredibly fluid. Flashpoints are always there, just beneath the surface.
And the potential for future conflict is still very real.
It is. You look at Iran's nuclear ambitions, which haven't gone away, their regional activities supporting groups like Hezbollah, Hamas. Their missile development continues. The possibility of military conflict, it remains a significant ongoing concern. It's a relationship where the past is very much shaping the present and the future.
It really leaves you thinking, doesn't it, when you have so much history, this long shadow. How do nations ever really break free from those old patterns?
It's the core question.
What would it actually take to shift that deep-seated mistrust? Especially when so many of these historical grievances feel so alive, still impacting policies and people today. That's maybe something to ponder long after this deep dive ends.